Welcome to Storyflix. In this video, we will explain spring, summer, fall, winter and spring. This movie tells the story of a young Buddhist apprentice who is mentored by an aging monk at a secluded monastery in the Korean wilderness. As a teenager, the apprentice encounters a girl who arrives at the monastery seeking assistance with her health. The boy has been tempted away from his spiritual existence for a few days into a sexual relationship. He leaves the monastery to follow the girl into a modern way of life he has never known and is unprepared for. Will love actually bring trouble to him? Let's find out in spring, summer, fall, winter and spring. Spring, summer, fall, winter, and spring tells about the life of a Buddhist monk as he passes through the seasons of his life from childhood to old age. At the beginning of the film, we will be shown a little Buddhist monk whom I will refer to as Lee. Lee lives with his master, an elderly Buddhist monk, in a small floating monastery, drifting on a lake in the serene forested mountains of Korea. Lee and his master lived a very simple life and always kept busy with prayer and meditation. Daily, they use old rowboats to reach the shores of the lake, where they regularly head into the forest to exercise and gather food and medicinal herbs. As a boy in general, Lee is an innocent child. He likes to play and is always happy, even though he lives a simple life in the jungle with only his master. One day, in a river between rocky hills, Lee tortured a fish by tying a small rock to it with a rope and laughing as the fish struggled to swim. He also did the same thing to frogs and snakes not long after. However, unbeknownst to Lee, his master secretly observed the boy on all three occasions. Because of Lee's actions, which seemed happy when he saw other living beings suffering, his master then tied a large stone to his body while he was sleeping. In the morning, his master told Lee that he would not let go of the stone until he untied the stone to the living creature he had tortured. The teacher then added that, if one of them died, then he would carry the stone in his heart forever. Realizing the mistake he had made, Lee then went to look for the three animals. He stepped into the river and through the woods hastily bearing the weight on his back. He found the fish he had tortured lying dead at the bottom of the river, while the frog was still alive and still at the location he left it. Meanwhile, the snake is in a pool of blood where it is likely to be pounced on and preyed upon by other animals as it cannot escape. The master watched as the boy began to weep bitterly at what he had done to the snake and regretted his actions. Long story short, time passed. Lee has now become a teenage boy, and like most teenagers, he is also going through puberty. One day, Lee met a mother and daughter who I will call Yuri, walking through the forest. Lee greeted them and then led them across the lake to the monastery, having learned of the mother's intentions of seeking out the monastery to care for ailing Yuri. When he arrived at the monastery and met his master, the mother told him that her daughter had an unknown disease and showed fever symptoms. The mother hoped that the Buddhist master would treat Yuri's strange illness and begged her daughter to be allowed to stay in the monastery for a while. The master agreed to let the teenage girl stay in the monastery for a while, and after that the mother left there. Over the next few days, Lee found himself sexually attracted to Yuri, but too shy to say anything, and busied himself praying and concocting herbal medicines with his master for Yuri's treatment. One day, Lee found Yuri sleeping in front of the Buddha statue. He then went in there and groped the girl's breasts out of curiosity. But then, Yuri woke up and directly slapped him. In a panic, because he felt so guilty, Lee began to pray non-stop. Seeing Lee, who looked full of regret, Yuri touched his shoulder, indicating that she might have forgiven his actions. After that incident, Lee and Yuri became even closer, where they then wandered into the forest and recklessly had sex. Because of the turmoil of the burning desire of youth, Yuri and Lee repeated the action over the next several nights, hiding their intimate relationship as best they could from his master, until finally the master found Yuri and Lee asleep naked, drifting around the lake in a rowboat. The master then woke them up by pulling the plug out of the drain hole in the boat. Instead of expressing anger or disappointment, his master simply warned Lee that lust leads to desire for possession, and possessions leads to murder. The master then told Yuri that she had recovered from her illness and had to leave the monastery immediately. The next morning, the master rowed the boat and took her away. Lee looked heartbroken and very frustrated after Yuri's departure because this was the first time he had been so passionately in love with a woman. Unable to contain his longing for Yuri, Lee then decided to run away from the monastery to chase Yuri. He then took away a Buddha statue from the monastery and a rooster with him. The implications of his two thefts are that while he is burdened with his craving as symbolized by the rooster, he also has the burden of his master's teachings symbolized by the Buddha statue. Years later, the aging master had just returned from the local village and got some groceries and brought a cat during the fall. Coincidentally, the master catches a glimpse of his former student, Li, in a newspaper where Li is now a fugitive and wanted for the murder of his wife. The master predicted that his apprentice would come back to the monastery, so he then readied the clothes to be worn by the disciple, and soon after, Li finally appeared at the spiritual door by the lake. Li returned to the convent in a rage, carrying the bloodied knife he used to stab his wife for having an affair with another man. After that, Li, who did not want to continue his life anymore, carried out a ritual to end his life by closing his eyes, mouth and nose, and sat in front of the Buddha statue he had just returned to, waiting for death to pick him up. However, his master, who knew this, then beat Li viciously, stating that even though Li might have killed his wife, then he should not just end his life without taking responsibility for his actions first. The master then tied his bloodied disciple to the ceiling of the monastery and lit candles to burn through the ropes slowly. After that, the master held the cat in his hands, dipped his tail in the bowl filled with black ink, and started writing the perfection of wisdom in Chinese characters on the monastery deck. Li finally fell and decided to start his conversion. After Li cut his hair and put his clothes back on, he was then ordered by his teacher to carve the words "the perfection of wisdom" into the wood to calm his heart. Moments later, two detectives arrive at the convent to arrest Li, but his master asks them to allow him to stay until the next day so that he can complete his task. Li continued to do his job of carving writing into the wood all night and fell asleep right after he finished. Inspired by the master's soothing presence, the detectives then helped the old monk to paint his pupils' engravings in orange, green, blue and purple. This also seems to calm the hearts of the detectives. The next day, Li finally woke up with the anger gone and felt peace welling up in his heart. He was then taken away by detectives, with the cat accompanying them in the back of the boat. After Li and the detectives leave, the master realizes that his life might not be long, so he then collects the woodpile in the rowboat. The master then covered his ears, eyes, nose, and mouth with paper in the same death ritual that his apprentice had done. The master then meditated until his body went limp and eventually burned to death. The master's tears could be seen through the paper seals as the old man was engulfed in flames, and a snake swam from the rowboat towards the monastery. Long story short, several years later, Li was finally released on parole and decided to return to the monastery. He arrived at the frozen lake and carefully stepped towards the monastery, which had been uninhabited for years since his master's death. Arriving at the monastery, Li finds his master's clothes laid out before his death and excavates his master's teeth from the frozen rowboat. He then carved a Buddha statue out of ice, wrapped the sarira, which is a small crystal sometimes found among the cremated remains of monks and considered a sacred relic belonging to his master, in a red cloth, and placed it on the statue where the third eye was. We'll see it under the waterfall. Li then found a book on the meditative attitude of choreography and started practicing and exercising in the freezing cold weather. Some time later, a woman came to the monastery with a scarf wrapped around her face while holding her baby boy. The woman then left her son in the convent and fled at night. But as the woman runs across the frozen lake, she accidentally stumbles into a hole in the ice dug by Li. The next day, Li found the woman's body. He then pulled the woman's body out of the water to see her face, though it wasn't shown to the camera. The scene then switches to showing Li, who is about to meditate to complete a long self-discipline. Li tied a large circular grinding stone to his body, which is a symbol of the Buddha Bhavacakra, the wheel of life and rebirth. He picked up the Buddha to come statue, Maitreya, from the monastery and climbed to the highest peak of the surrounding mountains. As he climbed up, dragging the stone wheel behind him and struggling to carry the statue, he contemplated the fish, frogs, and snakes he had abused. Upon reaching the top, he prayed and left the statue sitting on a circular millstone and overlooking the monastery on the lake far below. Back to spring again, the cycle begins again. Li, who is now the new master, lives in a convent with an abandoned baby, who is now both a boy and his student. The film ends by showing the boy torturing the turtle in front of the monastery. Wandering into the rocky hills that was the same as his master in his childhood, the boy appears to be giggling as he forces the rock into the mouths of fish, frogs and snakes. The film plot unfolds rather simply, but the implications of the characters' actions are quietly commented upon by the presence of Buddhist symbols and iconography. The lesson we can learn from this film is that we will actually experience several life cycles that will change us partially or completely as human beings. However, we will achieve and realize the best of ourselves by realizing every mistake we make, admitting it honestly, and taking responsibility for it with all the consequences that we will face, and afterward repent not to repeat the mistake and try to guide people to don't get lost and follow in our footsteps in the past.